In a town named Prosperity, kindness was a currency no one could afford, and cruelty was dealt out for free on the dusty main street. Every day the widow Eleanor Vance paid that price, enduring the scorn and stones of a town that had judged her guilty without a trial. And every day from the quiet shade of the livery stable a man watched. He was not a lawman nor a preacher. He was Silas Blackwood, an Apache with more land and gold than any man in the territory, and therefore the most hated. He was a ghost in his own land, a silent witness to her suffering. What happens when a man who has nothing but wealth decides to buy the one thing he can't have justice for a woman he's never spoken to? His solution was unthinkable, a scandal that would either save them both or burn them to the ground. He would take her as his bride. The sun over the Arizona territory was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the life from anything that wasn't stubborn enough to survive. In the town of Prosperity, the sun had an ally in its daily cruelty, the good townsfolk themselves. Their target was always the same: Eleanor Vance. She emerged from her small clapboard house at the edge of town, the one her late husband Robert had built with his own hands. She carried an empty basket, her dark dress a stark silhouette against the blinding glare. Her destination was Miller's Mercantile, a journey of a few hundred yards that felt like a mile-long gauntlet. It began with the whispers, insidious as wind-blown sand from the women sweeping their porches. Murderer one would hiss just loud enough to carry. Look at her, not even a tear for poor Robert, another would add, fanning herself with a pious frown. Then came the children. Emboldened by their parents' venom, they would dart out from behind rain barrels, their hands full of pebbles and dirt clods. The first one struck her shoulder, a small, sharp sting. She didn't flinch. She had learned that any reaction, a cry of pain or a sharp retort, only fueled their glee. She kept her eyes fixed on the warped boards of the walkway ahead, her face a pale, emotionless mask. Another pebble struck her back. A clump of dirt splattered against the hem of her skirt. From his position across the street, leaning against a support beam of the grand livery stable he owned, Silas Blackwood watched. He always watched. His stillness was profound, like that of a hawk on a thermal, observing everything, missing nothing. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth, his hair a fall of polished jet, tied back with a simple leather cord. He wore the clothes of a wealthy rancher, a tailored black coat, clean denim trousers, and expensive well-oiled boots. But they did nothing to disguise who he was. To the people of Prosperity, he was just the Apache, a man whose success was an affront, a constant nagging reminder of a world they were trying to tame and erase. They hated him for his wealth, which he'd earned through a preternatural understanding of horses, and a shrewd business sense that baffled them. He owned the finest breeding stock in the region, selling magnificent animals to the U.S. Army and wealthy Easterners. He owned the livery, the smithy, and, through quiet acquisition, the mortgages on half the businesses in town. He was a silent, powerful force they resented, but could not dislodge. His dark eyes, which could assess the health of a horse from 50 paces, followed Eleanor's lonely procession. He saw the tremble in her hands as she clutched the basket. He saw the rigid set of her spine, a desperate attempt to project a dignity she was denied. He saw the dust and spittle on her dress. He had seen this ritual unfold every day for 3 months, ever since her husband Robert Vance had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken. The town's verdict had been swift and absolute. Robert was a well-liked man, a charismatic dreamer who was always on the verge of a great success. Eleanor, his quiet, Eastern-bred wife, was an outsider. The whispers started immediately spun from the loom of jealousy and suspicion. She must have pushed him. She wanted his land, the quarter section he'd claimed that was rumored to have a year-round spring. Bartholomew Thorne, the town's undisputed patriarch and owner of the sprawling T-Bar ranch that bordered Vance's land, had been the first to give voice to the theory. A tragic accident, he'd declared in the saloon, his voice booming with false sympathy. But a man doesn't just fall into a ravine on a clear day. Not without a reason. The reason everyone decided was Eleanor. Today the cruelty was sharper. Hank, one of Thorne's oafish ranch hands, stepped directly into Eleanor's path. He was a big man, smelling of cheap whiskey and unwashed sweat. "Mornin', Mrs. Vance," he sneered, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Going to buy yourself something pretty with that inheritance money?" Eleanor tried to step around him. He blocked her again. "I asked you a question, killer." She said nothing, her gaze remaining fixed on the ground past his boots. His hand shot out and grabbed the basket, yanking it from her grasp. It fell to the street, wicker cracking. Clumsy Hank chuckled, looking to the small crowd that had gathered. From across the street, Silas pushed himself off the post. He didn't stride or hurry. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly silent, his boots making no sound on the dusty ground. He crossed the street, and the small crowd parted for him as if he were a phantom. They feared his wealth and were unnerved by his silence. He stopped a few feet from Hank, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply looked at Hank, his black eyes unblinking, holding an unnerving depth like looking down a deep, dark well. There was no overt threat, no clenching of fists. There was only a profound and absolute stillness, an implicit promise of violence more terrifying than any drunken boast. Hank's bravado withered under that gaze. He was used to bluster and noise, not this predatory calm. He licked his lips, his eyes darting from Silas to the faces in the crowd, finding no support. "Just having a bit of fun," Hank stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. Silas's eyes narrowed fractionally. It was the only sign of his displeasure. He took one more slow step forward. Hank scrambled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. He mumbled something incoherent and scurried away toward the saloon, the laughter of his cronies dying in their throats. Silas bent down, his movements fluid. He picked up the damaged basket and offered it to Eleanor. Her head was still bowed. She wouldn't look at him. She was trembling not from fear of Hank, but from the humiliation of being defended. To be saved by the town's other pariah was just a different kind of shame. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and resonant, with a gravelly texture that spoke of disuse. She finally raised her head. Her eyes, a startling shade of grey, like a storm-swept sea, were filled with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a flicker of defiance. She had expected to see pity in his face, or perhaps the smug satisfaction of a savior. She saw neither. His expression was impassive, unreadable. She snatched the basket from his hand, the contact of her fingers against his, sending a strange jolt through her. "I don't need your help," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She turned and practically fled toward the mercantile, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the street. The whispers of the town resumed, now tinged with a new speculative venom, the Apache and the murderess. What strange new drama was this? Silas watched her go, then turned and walked back to his livery. He didn't care about the whispers. He was a man who lived in a world of his own, making a world of silence and observation. But what he had just seen in Eleanor Vance's eyes was something he understood better than anyone in this town of gossips and bullies. It was the look of a soul being ground into dust. And for the first time in a very long time, his silence felt less like a choice and more like a failure. The intervention on the street changed nothing, And yet it changed everything. The physical assaults lessened for a day or two, replaced by a heavier, more suffocating blanket of scorn. Eleanor felt Silas Blackwood's eyes on her whenever she was in town, a silent, unnerving presence that was neither comforting nor threatening. It was simply there, a constant. The town noticed it too, and their speculation grew wilder, more sordid. Bartholomew Thorne was a man who didn't like constants he couldn't control. He was a stout, florid man, whose expensive suits couldn't hide the brutish set of his shoulders. He considered prosperity his personal fiefdom, and Eleanor's continued presence on a piece of land he coveted was a festering splinter in his thumb. Her husband Robert had been a fool, but a useful one. Thorne had planned to swindle the land from him eventually, but his untimely death had complicated matters. Now, with the Apache's shadow looming over the situation, Thorne felt a new urgency. He decided on a more direct approach. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the horizon, he rode out to her small homestead. He didn't bother with the gate, simply leading his horse through a weak section of fence. Eleanor was in the small garden behind the house, pulling weeds with a fierce, desperate energy. Mrs. Vance Thorne's voice boomed, startling her. She rose slowly, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron. She faced him, her small frame looking impossibly fragile against the vast, darkening landscape. "Mr. Thorne?" "Working hard, I see," he said, dismounting. He let the reins drop. His horse was trained to stand. A lot of work for a woman alone. "This land, it requires a man's hand." "I manage," she said, her voice tight. For now, Thorne said, walking closer. He surveyed the small house, the struggling garden, the rickety-looking corral. His lip curled in a sneer. "But winter is coming. The well is shallow. The roof needs patching. It's no secret Robert left you with nothing but debts." This was true. Robert's charm had been his only real currency. "We were fine. You were not fine." Thorne snapped, his pleasantries evaporating. He owed money all over. He owed me a considerable sum. "I have the papers to prove it." He patted his breast pocket. "I'm here to make you a generous offer. An act of Christian charity, you might say. I will assume all of Robert's debts. In return, you sign the deed to this worthless patch of dirt over to me. I'll even throw in $500, enough to get you back east where you belong." $500 was an insult. The land with its spring was worth 10 times that, at least. It was the only thing of value she had left in the world. "The land is not for sale," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Thorne's face darkened. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Eleanor. The people of this town believe you pushed your husband into that ravine for this very land. They will not stop. Do you think you can endure this forever? The stones, the whispers. Soon it will be worse. An accidental fire, perhaps. A stray gunshot in the night. There is no place for you here. I am offering you an escape." It wasn't an offer. It was a threat, bold and ugly. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. She looked at his cruel eyes and saw the town's hatred given a face. "Get off my land," she whispered. "I'll be back," he snarled. "And my next offer won't be so generous." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. Eleanor sank to her knees, the fight draining out of her. He was right. How long could she last? She was alone, friendless and penniless. The land was her only hope, but clinging to it felt like clinging to a rock in a tidal wave that was determined to drown her. She didn't know how long she knelt there, the cool earth beneath her, until a sound pulled her from her despair. The soft nicker of a horse. Her head snapped up. Standing just outside the broken fence line was Silas Blackwood, astride a magnificent black stallion that seemed carved from midnight. He had seen the whole exchange. He dismounted and walked toward her, not with the arrogance of Thorn, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He stopped a respectful distance away. The setting sun cast his features in sharp relief, all harsh angles and shadows. "He will not stop," Silas said. It was a statement, not a question. Eleanor got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. "That is my concern. He wants the spring on your northern pasture." Silas continued, his eyes scanning her property. "His own wells are running low. Without your water, his herd will suffer come the dry season." She stared at him, surprised by his astuteness. Robert had always bragged about the spring, his one true asset. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Was he here to make his own offer, to pick at the scraps Thorn had left behind? Thorn uses the town as his weapon. Silas said, his gaze finally meeting hers. "They are his pack. You cannot fight a pack alone." "I am aware of that," she said bitterly. "You need a shield," he stated. "A name they fear more than they hate." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "And where would I find such a thing?" Silas took a step closer. The air between them felt charged. "My name," he said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant timbre. "Blackwood." Eleanor's mind went blank. She couldn't have heard him right. "What are you talking about?" "The town despises me," he explained, his face unreadable. "But they are in my debt. Miller, the store owner, owes me for his stock. The blacksmith uses my forge. The saloon owner's mortgage is in my safe. They fear my ruin more than they crave my blood. Thorn fears me because he knows I cannot be bought or bullied." He paused, letting the word sink in. "They attack you because you are a Vance, a widow, alone. They would not dare attack the wife of Silas Blackwood." The word hung in the air between them. Wife. Eleanor felt a dizzying sense of unreality. This silent, intimidating man, this Apache outsider, was proposing marriage. "You're insane," she breathed. "I am practical," he corrected her calmly. "This would not be a marriage of the heart. It would be a contract, a business arrangement. I will give you my name and my protection. Your home and land will be safe. Thorn will not touch you again. The town will leave you be." "And what do you get in return?" she asked, her mind racing. "No man does something for nothing." He looked away from her, then his eyes on the distant, jagged mountains. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond his stoic mask, something that looked almost like weariness. "I am a wealthy man," he said, quietly. "I have horses, land, gold, but I eat my meals alone. My house is silent. I have a name, but no one to give it to. You would run my household. You would bring order. And I would have a companion to share the silence with." He looked back at her. "In return for my protection, you will give me a home." It was the most outlandish, desperate, and strangely logical proposition she had ever heard. To trade one prison for another. But was it a prison? His terms were simple, almost sterile. Protection for companionship, a shield for a home. She looked from his unyielding face to the house Robert had built, the land they had bled for. Thorn would take it. He would grind her down until she had nothing. What did she have to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters. Her freedom was an illusion. "They will talk even more," she whispered to the thought of the scandal, making her stomach clench. "Let them," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for an instant. "Their words are wind." "My name is Stone," he extended his hand. It was not a romantic gesture, but a seal to a bargain. His hand was large, calloused the hand of a man who worked despite his wealth. After a long moment of hesitation, a moment that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, Eleanor Vance placed her small, trembling hand in his. The deal was struck. The wedding, if it could be called that, was a stark and silent affair. It took place not in the town's dusty chapel, but in the territorial magistrate's office, in the county seat, a 2-day ride away. Silas had arranged everything with quiet efficiency. He procured the license, paid the magistrate, and stood beside Eleanor as the man mumbled the legal words that bound them together. Eleanor wore her best and only dress, a simple grey wool that felt more like a shroud than a wedding gown. Silas wore his customary black coat. They spoke their vows in low, clear voices, two strangers formalizing a contract. The only witnesses were the magistrate's bored clerk and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams. When they signed the ledger, her hand shook as she wrote Eleanor Blackwood. The name felt foreign, heavy, a cloak she wasn't sure she could bear to wear. The ride back to prosperity was as silent as the ride out. They rode side by side, Silas on his black stallion, and Eleanor on a gentle mare he had provided. He was a comfortable presence, his silence less menacing than it had once seemed. It was a deep, natural quiet, like that of the mountains themselves. Yet a chasm of unspoken questions lay between them. They were husband and wife, but they knew nothing of each other's pasts, dreams or fears. Their arrival in prosperity ignited a firestorm of disbelief and fury. The sight of Eleanor Vance riding into town beside Silas Blackwood, sitting tall on one of his fine horses, was shocking enough. The news which spread from the livery to the saloon in minutes that they had been married was an earthquake. The reaction was immediate and venomous. The women who had whispered "murderer" now spat "race traitor." The men who had pitied poor Robert now seethed at the thought of his widow in an Apache's bed. It was a scandal beyond their wildest imaginings, a violation of the unspoken ironclad rules of their world. The first test came that very afternoon. As Eleanor walked from the livery stable, her new home was Silas's large, well-built house, behind it towards the mercantile clem. Another of Thorne's lackeys saw his chance to make a point. He picked up a fist-sized rock, a familiar malice twisting his face. "Think a new name changes what you are, killer," he shouted, drawing his arm back. Before the rock could leave his hand, a shadow fell over him. Silas had moved with that same unnerving speed Eleanor had seen before. He didn't grab Clem's arm or shout a threat. He simply placed his hand flat on Clem's chest. There was no visible shove, but Clem stumbled back 5 feet as if he'd been hit by a mule, the rock dropping from his nerveless fingers. He landed hard in the dust, the air knocked from his lungs. Silas stood over him, his expression cold as riverstone. "She is Mrs. Blackwood now," he said, his voice low, but carrying with lethal clarity down the silent street. "Her name is my name. Her safety is my safety. If any man in this town raises a hand or a voice against her again, he will answer directly to me. There will be no second warning." He stared down at the gasping Clem for a moment longer, then turned his gaze on the stunned onlookers who had gathered on the boardwalks. His eyes swept over them, and for the first time, the people of prosperity understood the difference between the passive dislike they had for the wealthy Apache and the active danger he represented when provoked. The fear they had for him, once a vague and simmering resentment, crystallized into something sharp and immediate. They looked away, shuffling their feet, suddenly finding the contents of shop windows intensely interesting. Silas walked back to Eleanor's side. "Get what you need," he said softly. "I will wait." She walked into Miller's Mercantile with her head held high. The usual whispers died as she entered. Mr. Miller, a man who had often short-changed her, or claimed to be out of stock of what she needed, suddenly became a fountain of obsequious courtesy. Mrs. Blackwood. "Good day, good day. What can I get for you? We have fresh flour just in, and some fine bacon." The weight of the name was real. It was a shield, just as he had promised, but it was also a cage. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the suspected murderer. She was now Eleanor Blackwood, the Apache's wife, an object of fear and scandalous curiosity. Walking back to the livery basket, full with Silas at her side, she felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. She had escaped the pack, but only by sheltering with a lone wolf. His house was larger than she'd expected, built of solid timber with a wide porch. Inside it was Spartan, but immaculately clean. It was the house of a man who valued function over comfort. There were well-made chairs, a sturdy table, but no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no pictures on the walls. It was a shell, not a home. That night they ate in silence. Silas had shown her to a small but comfortable bedroom, separate from his own. The arrangement was clear. They were partners in a business, sharing a roof, but not a life. After the meal, he sat by the cold hearth cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. Eleanor found herself watching him. Who was this man? Where had he come from? How had he amassed such wealth in a world that so clearly wanted him to have nothing? "You never speak of your past." She said the words, surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise him. He stopped his work, looking up at her. The firelight from the lantern cast deep shadows on his face. "There is little to tell," he said. "My people were traders. We learned to walk in two worlds. When the army came, my father saw the future. He did not fight a war he knew could not be won. He made treaties. He traded horses. He learned the white man's ways, his language, his love of gold. He taught me." "And your mother?" she asked gently. A flicker of pain, so quick she almost missed it, crossed his face. "She died when I was young. The coughing sickness. The white man's ways brought curses as well as gold." He fell silent, returning to his work, the brief opening into his past. Closing shut as quickly as it had appeared, Eleanor felt a sudden, unexpected pang of empathy. He was as alone as she was. He had built a fortress of wealth around himself, but inside it he was just a man eating his meals in silence. She had entered that fortress seeking shelter, but she was beginning to realize that perhaps he had let her in, because he too was tired of the solitude. That night, lying in her unfamiliar bed, Eleanor Blackwood listened to the quiet sounds of the house, and wondered if two lonely people, bound by a contract, could ever truly build a home out of a house. The name had given her safety, but she was beginning to understand its price was a deeper, more complicated kind of isolation. Life settled into a strange new rhythm. The town kept its distance. The open hostility Eleanor had faced was replaced by a wary, resentful silence. She was now an untouchable, a figure of fearful speculation. When she went to the mercantile, the street would clear, and shopkeepers would serve her with a strained politeness that was almost as insulting as their previous scorn. But there were no more stones, no more shouted curses. The shield of the Blackwood name held firm. Within the silent walls of their house, Eleanor and Silas coexisted like two celestial bodies held in a careful orbit by a force they didn't understand. She took over the running of the household as their contract stipulated. She brought life to the sterile space, planting a small kitchen garden, hanging simple curtains she sewed herself, and filling the rooms with the scent of baking bread. She found that bringing order to the house brought a measure of order to her own chaotic soul. Silas observed these changes with his usual quietude, but she noticed he started spending more time in the house and less in the livery office. He would watch her knead dough or mend a shirt, his dark eyes following her movement. Sometimes after dinner, he would speak not of his past, but of his work. He told her of horses of bloodlines and temperaments, of the subtle language of their bodies. She learned that his stoicism with people was replaced by an almost spiritual connection with his animals. He was a man who understood things that did not speak in words. In turn, she found herself telling him about her life back east, of her love for books and music, things that seemed a world away from the grit of prosperity. They were discovering the people behind the labels the murderous and the Apache. But the shadow of Robert's death still hung over them. While the town no longer dared to accuse her publicly, Eleanor knew the verdict in their hearts remained unchanged, and she saw in Silas's eyes that he knew it too. His protection was a dam holding back a flood of hatred. It had not made the water disappear. One evening, Silas came home later than usual. He smelled of cheap whiskey, though he was perfectly sober. "I was at the saloon," he said, answering her unasked question. "I didn't think you went there," she replied, surprised. The saloon was Thorne's throne room. "I don't drink there." "I listen," he said. He sat at the table, his face looking weary in the lamplight. "I spoke with a man named Finn, a drunk. But drunks often see things sober. Men miss, and their tongues are loosened by spirits." Eleanor knew of Finn. He did odd jobs and drank away his meagre pay, a sad, shambling figure on the edges of town life. Finn was camped out in the hills the night Robert died. Silas continued, his voice low and steady. "He was hiding drying out," he says. "From his camp he had a view of the trail leading to the ravine." Eleanor leaned forward, her heart starting to beat faster. Did he see something? He saw 2 men riding that trail shortly after sundown. Your husband was one of them. 2 men Eleanor's blood ran cold. The story everyone accepted was that Robert had been riding home alone. Who was the other one? He couldn't see his face in the dark, Silas said. But he saw his horse, a big sorrel with a white blaze and 3 white socks, a very distinctive animal. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, her mind racing. A big sorrel. "Bartholomew Thorne," she whispered. "He rides a horse just like that. He calls him King." Silas nodded slowly. "It is as I suspected. The implication was monstrous. Thorne hadn't just spread the rumors about her. He had been there. He could have been the last person to see her husband alive. The next day, Silas rode out of town without a word. He was gone for 2 days. Eleanor was consumed by a nervous energy, her newfound peace shattered. The shield of his name felt terribly thin without the man himself nearby. When he returned, he was dusty and grim-faced. He brought with him an old acquaintance, Dr. Albright from the county seat, a man with a reputation for honesty that was rare in the territory. Mrs. Blackwood, the doctor, said, his eyes kind. "Your husband asked me to come. He has some questions about the official report on your first husband's death." Silas had convinced the doctor to look again at the hasty examination performed by Prosperity's town doctor, a man firmly in Thorne's pocket. They sat at the kitchen table, and Silas laid out what he had learned. "Finn's story is a start," Silas explained to them both, "but a drunk's word is worth little. We need more." He then turned to Eleanor. "When Robert died, what happened to his belongings? His saddlebags?" "The marshal gave them to me," Eleanor said. "It was just, some papers. Bills, mostly. I put them in his trunk." She retrieved the old leather satchel. Together they sifted through the contents. It was mostly, as she remembered, invoices for feed a letter from his sister receipts. But tucked into a hidden pocket, Silas's nimble fingers found a small folded document she had never seen before. It was a bill of sale. and it was signed by both Robert Vance and Bartholomew Thorne. Dr. Albright adjusted his spectacles and read it aloud. It documented the sale of 100 head of cattle from Thorne to Vance, a transaction for a staggering sum of money. But the cattle were all branded with the T-Bar brand. "This makes no sense," Dr. Albright said. "Why would your husband buy cattle from Thorne that were already Thorne's?" Silas stared at the paper, his dark eyes narrowed in concentration. "Unless the cattle never existed," he said softly. "Unless this bill of sale was created for another purpose." He looked at Eleanor. "Was your husband planning on applying for a loan?" Eleanor's mind flashed back. "Yes." She breathed. He was. He was going to the bank in the county seat. He said he had secured a major asset to use as collateral. He said it was the key to our future. The pieces of the puzzle began to slide into place, forming a dark and ugly picture. "It's a common fraud," Dr. Albright sighed, rubbing his temples. "Thorne creates a false bill of sale, making it look like Vance owns a valuable herd. Vance uses the fraudulent document to secure a large bank loan. He then splits the money with Thorne defaults on the loan, and the bank is left holding a worthless piece of paper. The only problem is, the bank would eventually send an inspector to verify the herd Silas finished for him, and they would find no cattle. The scheme would unravel. A terrible realization dawned on Eleanor's face. Robert. He wasn't a dreamer. He was a criminal. The image of her husband, the charming, ambitious man she had loved, fractured and fell away, replaced by the portrait of a common swindler. And it seems Silas said his voice grim that he had a change of heart. Perhaps he intended to confess, or perhaps he tried to double-cross Thorne and keep all the money. Either way, Thorne couldn't allow him to talk. The motive was no longer just the land and the spring. It was bigger. It was about a crime that could send Thorne to a federal prison. He hadn't just stumbled upon Robert's accident and used it to his advantage. He had orchestrated it. He had killed Robert Vance, and then with breathtaking cruelty had manipulated an entire town into persecuting the man's innocent wife, ensuring she would be too broken and discredited to ever be believed. The whispers in the shadow had finally revealed the serpent hiding there. And now that serpent knew they were hunting for it, the discovery of the fraudulent bill of sale changed the atmosphere in the Blackwood home from one of quiet cohabitation to one of tense alliance. They were no longer just a man and a woman, bound by a contract. They were partners in a dangerous conspiracy, united against a common enemy. The knowledge that Thorne was not just a bully, but a cold-blooded killer, lent a new urgency to their every action. Dr. Albright, a man of integrity, agreed to keep their findings confidential. The word of a drunk and a piece of paper aren't enough to hang a man like Thorne, he warned them before he left. He owns the law in prosperity. You'll need more. You'll need irrefutable proof, or you'll be the ones ending up in a shallow grave. Thorne, with the cunning of a predator, must have sensed the shift in the wind. Perhaps Finn, in a moment of whiskey-fueled guilt or fear, had confessed to being questioned. Perhaps Thorne's spies in town reported the doctor's visit. Whatever the reason, the serpent began to coil, and its attacks became more direct, aimed not at Eleanor, but at the foundations of Silas's power. The first blow came at night, at a fire deliberately set that swept through a northern pasture, destroying 1,000 acres of prime grazing land and scattering a portion of his herd. Silas and his few loyal ranch hands fought the blaze for an entire night, their faces grimed with soot, their lungs burning. Eleanor worked alongside them, hauling buckets of water until her arms felt like lead and her hands were raw. In the smoky dawn, as they surveyed the blackened, smouldering landscape, She saw a flicker of raw fury in Silas's eyes. It was a personal attack on his livelihood, a declaration of war. A few days later, one of his prize stallions, a magnificent creature worth a fortune, was found dead at a water trough, its body contorted in the agony of poison. This was not the work of a common rancher. It was a vicious, targeted assault meant to cripple him financially and break his spirit. Silas absorbed these blows with his characteristic stoicism, but Eleanor could see the toll they were taking. The lines around his eyes deepened. He became even more silent, his watchfulness taking on a sharper, more dangerous edge. He was being drawn into a fight on Thorn's terms, a war of attrition and terror. Eleanor refused to be a helpless bystander. While Silas fortified his ranch, she began her own quiet investigation. She had lived with Robert. She knew his habits, his hiding places. She searched their old house from top to bottom, driven by a desperate need to find the final piece of proof Dr. Albright had said they needed. She tapped walls, lifted floorboards, and sifted through every forgotten box in the attic. Her search led her to Robert's old writing desk. She had cleared it out months ago, or so she had thought. But as she ran her hand along the underside, her fingers brushed against a small, loose piece of wood. It was a false bottom. Prying it open with a letter opener, she found a slim, leather-bound ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with Robert's familiar looping script. It wasn't a record of ranch expenses. It was a detailed accounting of his and Thorn's entire scheme. Dates, amounts, plans for how to deceive the bank inspector. But the last few entries were different. They were filled with fear and regret. Thorn is a devil, Robert had written. He speaks of the loan as if the money is already his. He has no conscience. I cannot go through with this. The guilt is a stone in my gut. I told him I wanted out, that I would go to the marshal. He laughed in my face. He said there is only one way out of a partnership with him. The final entry was dated the day of his death. He is coming for me tonight. He says we will ride out and talk things over. I know what that means. If I do not return, know that it was Bartholomew Thorn who sealed my fate. This book is the only proof. I pray Eleanor finds it. Eleanor sank into the chair, the ledger clutched to her chest. Here it was, Robert's final confession and Thorn's condemnation, written in the hand of a dead man. It was the irrefutable proof they needed. But it was also Robert's death warrant. Her grief for the man she thought she had married was replaced by a cold pity for the weak, frightened man he had truly been, a man who had gotten in too deep with a monster and paid the ultimate price. She raced back to Silas's house, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. She found him in the barn, gently tending to one of his horses. He saw the look on her face and immediately stopped what he was doing. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. Wordlessly, she handed him the ledger. He read the final entries, his face, an unreadable mask, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. When he looked up, his eyes were like chips of obsidian. He signed his own death warrant. Silas said, his voice a low growl. "And Thorns, what do we do now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't go to the town marshal. He's Thorn's man." No, Silas agreed. "We cannot use their law. We must use ours." He closed the ledger. "Thorn started this war by trying to destroy my name and my livelihood. He tried to ruin your life. Now we will use this book to end it. We will not hide in the shadows any longer. We will bring the truth into the light, right in the heart of his kingdom." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of something beyond their contract in his eyes. It was respect. It was the look of a partner, an equal. "He thinks he has crippled me," Silas said, a dangerous calm settling over him. He has forgotten that a cornered wolf is the most dangerous beast of all. The serpent had coiled and struck, but in doing so, it had exposed itself, and now the wolf was preparing to strike back. The heart of prosperity and of Bartholomew Thorne's power was the Grand Saloon. It was a place of dark wood, stale beer, and whispered deals. This was where Thorne held court, where public opinion was forged over poker hands and shots of rye. It was here Silas decided that the reckoning must take place. A public accusation was the only weapon they had against a man who owned the law. He planned it for dusk, the time when the saloon would be most crowded, with ranchers, cowboys, and townsfolk seeking to wash away the day's dust. He did not ask Eleanor to stay behind. He knew without speaking it that this was her fight as much as his. She had found the proof. She deserved to witness the justice. They walked down the main street together, Silas with the ledger tucked inside his coat, Eleanor at his side. Her presence was a statement in itself. The townspeople, sensing the charged atmosphere, stopped what they were doing and watched them pass. The usual whispers were absent, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. This felt different. This felt final. As they pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to them. Bartholomew Thorne was at his usual table in the back, surrounded by his sycophants, including Hank and Clem. A triumphant, gloating smile was fixed on his face. He clearly believed his campaign of terror had broken the Apache. "Well, well," Thorne boomed, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Look what the cat dragged in. Come for a drink, Blackwood? Or has your pretty little wife finally convinced you to sell me that worthless patch of land she squats on?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting the gazes of the men assembled there. Eleanor stood just behind his shoulder, her posture rigid, her face pale but resolute. "I'm not here to drink, Thorne." "Silas," said his voice, cutting through the silence. "And I'm not here to sell. I'm here to talk about Robert Vance." Thorne's smile tightened at the edges. "Old news. The man was clumsy. His murdering widow knows all about it." He gestured dismissively at Eleanor. "He wasn't clumsy," Silas countered, his voice rising in volume, ensuring every man in the room could hear. "And his wife is not a murderer. But there is a murderer in this room." He let the accusation hang in the air. The crowd murmured men, shifting uncomfortably. This was more than the usual tension between the two powerful men. This was a direct challenge. "You're insane, you savage." Thorne snarled, his face beginning to flush with anger. "Am I?" Silas pulled the ledger from his coat and held it up. "Or was Robert Vance your partner in a scheme to defraud the Territorial Bank? Was this ledger in his own hand detailing your plan to use non-existent cattle to secure a loan? Is that insanity?" He opened the book and began to read from the last damning entry. "He is coming for me tonight. He says we will ride out and talk things over. I know what that means. If I do not return, know that it was Bartholomew Thorne who sealed my fate." A collective gasp went through the saloon. The men looked from the ledger in Silas's hand to Thorne's face, which was now a mask of pure fury. "Lies," Thorne roared, shoving his chair back as he stood up, forged by this murdering whore to save her own skin. "Then you won't mind if the U.S. Marshal I sent for yesterday takes a look at this ledger, will you?" Silas said, calmly, bluffing perfectly. "Or if he questions a man named Finn about the horse he saw on the trail that night, a big sorrel with a white blaze and 3 white socks." Every eye in the room flickered toward Thorne's men, then back to him. They knew the horse. King. The foundation of Thorn's power, built on fear and intimidation, was cracking before their eyes. The loyalty of the men around him was not to him, but to their own self-preservation. Thorn saw it in their faces. He was cornered. His folksy charm and brute force were useless against a dead man's words. His hand dropped to the Colt at his hip. "You should have stayed on the reservation, Apache." The world seemed to slow down. Silas had been waiting for this. He had not worn a gun, a deliberate choice, to show he had come to speak the truth, not to fight. But he was not unarmed. As Thorn's gun cleared its holster, Silas moved. He kicked the nearest table, sending it crashing into Thorn's legs, throwing off his aim. The shot went wide, splintering the bar. Before Thorn could recover, Silas flowed forward with a speed that was almost inhuman. He wasn't a brawler, he was a warrior. He moved inside Thorn's reach, his hand striking the man's wrist with brutal precision. Bones crunched, and the Colt clattered to the floor. Thorn howled in pain and rage, swinging his good arm in a wild punch. Silas ducked under it, his shoulder driving hard into Thorn's midsection. The bigger man staggered back, gasping for air, crashing into his own table. But Thorn was not done. With a roar, he grabbed a whiskey bottle and swung it like a club. Silas deflected the blow with his forearm, the glass shattering. Ignoring the stinging cuts, he drove his fist into Thorn's jaw. The sound was like a rock cracking. Thorn stumbled, his eyes glazing over. He was beaten. The entire saloon had witnessed his public humiliation and the evidence of his crimes. His reign was over. But as he fell, his eyes landed on Eleanor. A final spiteful act of pure evil flashed in them. He had a small derringer tucked into his boot. With a final desperate effort, he lunged for it. Eleanor screamed. Silas turned, but it was too late. The small pistol was in Thorn's hand, pointed not at Silas, but at her. A gunshot echoed in the saloon, deafeningly loud. But it wasn't the pop of the derringer. It was the deep boom of a shotgun. Clem Thorn's man stood by the bar, his face ashen, the saloon's scattergun smoking in his hands. Bartholomew Thorn lay on the floor, his chest a bloody ruin, the derringer unfired beside his twitching fingers. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of someone's nervous breathing. Clem looked at Silas, then at the shocked faces around him. He was going to shoot the lady, Clem stammered, justifying his action. He had seen which way the wind was blowing. Siding with a dead murderer was a bad bet. He had saved himself by saving her. The reign of Bartholomew Thorn was over-ended, not by the hero, but by the cowardly betrayal of his own man. The truth, finally brought into the light, had proven to be a weapon more powerful than any gun. The aftermath was swift. With Thorn dead and Robert's ledger in the hands of the U.S. Marshal, Eleanor's name was officially cleared. The town of Prosperity, shamed by the truth of its own cruelty, retreated into a sullen silence. Their open hostility was replaced by a grudging respect for the man and woman who had unseated their king. Seizing the opportunity Silas acquired, Thorn's forfeited lands, securing the future of the now dominant Blackwood Ranch. The silence within their house was different, now filled with the comfortable weight of a shared victory. The true turning point came one evening, as dusk settled. Silas approached Eleanor with a small gift, a book of poems she had once mentioned. It was a sign he saw her not as a contract, but as a person. "The arrangement is fulfilled," he said, his voice low. "You are free. I will provide for your passage back east if you wish it." He was offering her an escape, an end to their bargain. She looked from the book to the quiet, powerful man before her. To leave this harsh land was tempting, but it meant leaving him. "And what would you do?" she asked softly. "Go back to eating your meals alone?" A rare, warm smile touched his face. "The house has grown loud," he admitted. "I am not sure I would remember how to enjoy the silence." "My garden is just starting to take root," Eleanor replied, her choice clear in her calm gaze. "I think I should like to stay and see it grow." The contract born of desperation had dissolved. In its place was a partnership forged in fire and respect. No longer just allies under one roof, Silas and Eleanor Blackwood finally and truly began to build their home. The story of Silas and Eleanor Blackwood is more than just a tale of the Old West. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength is found in quiet endurance, and the purest justice is forged in the fires of adversity. Theirs was a partnership built not on whispered sweet nothings, but on shared struggle, mutual respect, and the courage to stand against a world that had condemned them both. They proved that a name can be a shield, a house can be made a home. And even in the dustiest, most unforgiving corners of the world, dignity and love can take root and flourish. If their journey from dust and despair to devotion and dominion moved you, please help us share more tales of the untamed frontier. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with someone who appreciates a real saga of grit and redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. What part of Silas and Eleanor's story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone. Thank you for listening.